Welcome everyone again. Thanks again for coming. So this is our second talk as part of the Zer0 Utopia partnership. And today we have Anthony Galluzzo who's going to be talking about his new book with Zer0 Books. Just if in case it's your first time, Culture of the Future is an online forum from the CETAPS Research Center in Porto, Portugal, and we envision it as an online forum to discuss key issues for the study of the humanities and culture, and all of our talks and conversations are on YouTube. As I said, Culture of the Future, this one is in partnership with Zer0 Books. Zer0 Books has a book series called Zer0 Utopia, and it aims to uncover the utopian in all its dimensions. And Anthony is one of their authors. He is a writer and academic from New York. He's a lecturer at the New School, and he holds a PhD in English literature from the University of California, Los Angeles. His current work focuses on degrowth utopias and a constellation of thinkers he dubs critical Aquarians, which is coincidentally also what his latest book is about, Against the Vortex, and also what we'll be talking about today. So Anthony, thank you so much for coming. Without further ado, please go ahead.
All right, so I'm just gonna. Should I just start the talk? So I put together a series of slides. I mean, I don't know how many people have actually seen the film Zardoz. It's kind of a strange film, but I thought this would be better. So let me just share this. All right. I mean, for those of you who aren't familiar with the film, I mean, these are the two sort of images that are mostly associated with this film. They've had an afterlife as memes, actually. Sean Connery, his first major role after leaving the James Bond franchise in this kind of red leather getup, very hirsute, and this flying stone head. Who is Zardoz, this god whom we learn is not a god. So I'll start the paper. John Boorman's 1974 cult film oddity Zardoz is now mostly remembered for Connery's high camp red leather outfit and that eponymous flying stone head, who inaugurates the movie's narrative action and announces one theme in declaring, and this is one of the sort of like famous, most quotable lines from the film. The gun is good. The penis is evil. The penis shoots seeds and makes new life to poison the earth with the plague of man as once it was. But the gun shoots death and purifies the earth of the filth of the brutals. Go forth and kill. Zardoz has spoken. It's a good start. Although the film was a commercial and critical disaster, no less a figure than a young Frederick Jameson, future star Marxist literary theorist, thought the work significant enough to write on it at length soon after its release, and in a way that looks forward to his later ruminations on ideology and utopia, while Boorman himself considered the story important enough to put into novel form. So in my book, I deal with the film, but I also deal with this novel that he co-wrote with Bill Stair, who helped him on the film. And if you look at the preface to the novel, Boorman writes that the story came out of the ghost that stalked the Celtic twilight and pressed this strange vision of the future upon me. I mean, it was shot in Western Ireland, where he moved and where he still lives, actually, and he's like 91 years old at this point. Zardoz's Baroque plot, which Boorman and co-writer Stair further clarify and elaborate in their curious 1974 novelization, takes place in 2293 on an Earth devastated by nuclear war or ecological catastrophe, or both. It's unclear. The brutal human majority, mostly mutated due to the effects of radiation, as the novel makes clear, are kept in check by the exterminators, led by Zed, played by Connery. These exterminators alternately kill and enslave the brutals, forcing them to grow wheat, for instance, at one point, at the behest of Zardoz, the flying stone head who dispenses weapons and imperatives to his exterminator acolyte. So it's a kind of a strange cult. Zed, at one point, suspecting Zardoz is not all that he appears to be, slips into the flying stone head and hides among the exterminator's regular agricultural tribute, only to discover that this god is in fact a kind of an airship, a spaceship, piloted by this elaborately dressed human figure. And Zed kills the figure. The figure will come back, as we'll see, and the head goes down. The ship head goes down as a result, and it crash lands in a lush, high-tech oasis known as the Vortex. So this is like a wonderland. I mean, this is. I mean, keeping with the Wizard of Oz theme, it's the moment when sort of Dorothy arrives in Oz. This event inaugurates Zed's journey as he learns that the world, or the outlands outside the vortex, is in actuality run by these people called the Eternals. This is a technologically advanced human elite working in tandem with the supercomputer called the Tabernacle, and they possess seemingly godlike powers that include an ersatz immortality, as the Tabernacle repeatedly downloads each Eternal's consciousness into new bodies the supercomputer grows from the genetic codes it stores and controls. The Eternals manage the brutal majority by way of the stone heads and their exterminator devotees. The exterminators therefore unwittingly enforce the Eternals' murderous population and resource management imperatives. So, I mean, from the very beginning, I mean, there is a kind of an allegory between sort of the core, global north, the first world, embodied in the figure of the vortex, and the outlands, this devastated earth. Zed, immediately brings discord to the vortex. And hopefully, if you haven't seen the movie, some of you got a chance to read that first chapter where I synopsize the plot. The plot is fairly elaborate, so I'm going to touch on a couple of points, but I can't really summarize the plot. That would probably take hours. But Zed, he's kind of screws things up. He sets the informal leader Consuela, who's played by Charlotte Rampling, against May, Sari Kesselman, who you see on the screen there. Consuela wants to immediately kill Zed, while May, supported by a majority, prefers that he live, at least temporarily, for the purposes of the study. Hold on. Zed is made to play servant to a guy, a mortal named Friend, during this day of execution. Friend first exposes Zed to the rot in the vortex, the ennui and imbecility that come from what we might call post-singularity techno-immortalism, dramatically depicted in a growing subpopulation of apathetics. There are all of these immortals who have just gone catatonic and they don't know why. Friend also introduces his exterminator slave to the renegades. The renegades are Eternals who, in violating the tabernacle-enforced eternal consensus around norms of enlightened behavior and belief, are punished through expedited aging, leading to another group of impaired because geriatric immortals who want nothing so much as to die. And they have all of these very elaborate codes. It almost seems like an American small liberal arts college. Like everybody's afraid of sort of violating one of these norms and getting reported. Boorman's fable exemplifies that strand of early 70s countercultural thinking, what I call critical Aquarianism, that challenged the hypermodernist vision that drove both US capitalism and Soviet state socialism. Like such artist contemporaries as Ursula Le Guin and Russell Hoban, Boorman exemplified a certain strand of the late 60s counterculture that defined itself through the rejection of ossified modernist orthodoxies. We can see in the variegated output of these figures and various other intellectual travelers. I mean, I'm thinking, I write about figures like Norman O. Brown, Ivan Illich, Theodore Rozek, Maria Mies, Barry Commoner, Andre Gores, Paul Shepard, or even the young James Lovelock and Lynn Margulies. We see in these people, I argue, a deliberately eclectic program that combined individual exploration and communal spirit, folk traditionalism and avant-garde experimentation, finally reason and imagination in the vein of the first generation romantics at their most radical. Here was a critical Aquarianism encompassing a certain kind of neo-Luddism, and think about like the critical technology movement. Think about a figure like Illich, and a revisionist utopianism that accepted limits. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Whose advocates often position themselves against other Aquarianisms of the time, ranging from therapeutic cults of the self to hippie modernist cults of technology. I mean, think about Stuart Brand and the so-called California ideology, to cults. Plain and simple. I don't know. Think about Charlie Manson and his family. Much of the 60s era counterculture, like the modernist ideologies it's superficially questioned, still equated liberation or freedom with endless material growth, conceived in quantitative terms. But old and new lefts, for example, both old and new lefts, for example, wanted more. From the orthodox Marxist liberated forces of production to unleashed appetites and unhindered individualism promoted by large swaths of the counterculture. What distinguished the disparate artists and thinkers that I am calling critical Aquarian was their focus on limits and self-limitation as key to a more substantive form of liberation. And I should say that ecology and a dawning awareness of the environmental crisis played a significant role in this line of thought, although, as I hope to show in my reading of Boorman's film and its relationship with the overpopulation panic of the late 60s and 70s, this discourse of limits was distinct from or even opposed to the technocratic neo-Malthusianism, in many ways indistinguishable from neo-colonialism, that Malthusianism, that dominated the mainstream environmental movement that too often viewed nature and non-white peoples as standing reserve or resources to be managed so as to efficiently maximize capitalist growth patterns. Now, in Four Futures, Jacobin magazine editor Peter Fraze outlines four speculative futures ranging from a glorious high-tech post-work cornucopia to a post-collapse eco-dystopia. Each of these futures is refracted through a science fiction text. I mean, his preferred future is, of course, the Star Trek future, very much associated with these tendencies on the left that are neo-futurist, accelerationism, fully automated luxury communism, Star Trek socialism. I offer my reading of Zardoz as another sort of social science fiction. I mean, this is what Fraze calls his exercise. One that is also archaeological, as I excavate a broader post-60s movement and current of thought, decelerationist, neo-Luddite, and counter-modernist, as opposed to anti-modernist, of which Zardoz, I believe, is an example, a part, an artifact. This constellation, I believe, was an important forerunner of degrowth among other contemporary movements. Rather than recovering some incomplete project of modernity, then equating that project with the utopian impulse, I will argue that Zardoz challenges us to think utopia and limits together in a way that is inexplicable to those Star Trek socialists who cannot distinguish freedom and flourishing from Faustian final frontiers. In fact, Zardoz is very much a riposte to Star Trek in the Promethean fever dreams of post-war science fiction. The point, I think, is not to call for yet another grand future in the way of futurism, but to pull the emergency brake, after Walter Benjamin's famous call in his theses on the philosophy of history. So I don't know if we have enough time to get into this. A lot of the book is about Zardoz's engagement with the population scare of the 1970s. Justin Sully, in an essay entitled On the Cultural Projection of the Popular Crisis, the Case of the Omega Man, sees in the notably dystopian outpouring of popular science fiction films of the early to middle 1970s a concentrated cultural expression of popular anxieties about population during the period. And if you look on the screen, you'll see, that is the poster for this movie, The Omega Man. The other, it's next to a poster for a movie called Logan's Run. Again, it's like, these people who live in this sort of domed world, and they all have to, die. I believe it's at the age of 30. There's Soylent Green. So Zardoz, he also named Zardoz as one of these sort of population panic films. Zardoz was also a cinematic response to 60s and 70s era concerns over environmental degradation and overpopulation. In other words, even as many of the films Sully mentions reproduce racially coded neo-Malthusian fears of overpopulation, especially in the underdeveloped world, equating environmental deterioration with population pressure in the process. Zardoz offers a critical depiction of population control as a ruling class ruse. It's a critical and imaginative engagement with neo-Malthusianism and the nascent environmental movement. Distinct concerns with respectively distinct political programs that were too often identified with each other at the time due to the work of biologist Paul Ehrlich, whose best-selling Population Bomb, which he published in 1968, rang the alarm over human population growth, especially in the developing world. Ehrlich simplistically offers population growth outstripping scarce resources as the primary driver of poverty, famine, and war, updating Thomas Malthus's 1798 essay on population. I think Malthus's aims were explicitly political and conservative in character, as he argued for the inescapability of poverty against both ameliorative poor laws and the more utopian schemes for generalized human equality promoted by perfectibilists like William Godwin. Ehrlich's neo-Malthusian polemic was hardly conservative, as he married his fear of overpopulation to a prescient concern with the environmental degradation produced by advanced production and consumption technology. So that, he was aware of the work of people like Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson. I think what's telling for our purposes is that Ehrlich's response to the problem was very technocratic. Trust the experts, right? The crisis should be managed by demographers and scientific ecologists rather than women, for example, when we're talking about birth control. I think it was this brand of technocratic authoritarianism, which takes a more nakedly coercive and reactionary form in the work of fellow neo-Malthusian Garrett Hardin, that feminists and other representatives of the counterculture so violently broke with in the 70s. And that's an image of Garrett Hardin. It's a quote where he's positively invoking Tertullian, an early church father who wrote that the scourges of pestilence, famine, wars, and earthquakes, should be regarded as a blessing to overcrowded nations. Strangely, there are a lot of elements of the counterculture who are very much into the neo-Malthusian program, right? And it's these elements of the counterculture that I identify with something called hippie modernism. I mean, they were the same sterile hippie modernist Boorman saw in at least some of the communes of Northern California. Whole Earth Catalog founder and hippie digital tech prophet Brand saw in these communes a more resource-efficient form of social organization, perfectly suited to a nascent, decentralized computer network technology, the internet. So, just to sort of, cut some of this, for the sake of time, you had this sort of neo-Malthusian moment. Now, you have futurists who equate Malthusianism and primitivism. They also equate hippies to court with sort of anti-modernity. But in fact, there are these whole segments of the counterculture that were proto-technocratic, and this is the counterculture that blossomed into Silicon Valley, very much at the root of what we're looking at today. I think there's a lot of continuity, in fact, ironically, between these early sort of Malthusian population managers who are actually interested in safeguarding both capitalist growth and technological development in the global north, at the expense of the global south. And Boorman was very aware of this. At the time he's writing, he describes himself as a kind of a heterodox Marxist, a left-wing hippie. He was very, very attentive to the legacies of colonialism and British colonialism in particular. And he saw, I think, in uneven ecological exchange and the way that the overpopulation scare was being used, a kind of neo-colonialism. I think this is reflected directly in the film. Boorman sort of spoke to, was sort of pushing against this. In other words, another element that was very critical of was something called Illich calls technomania, right? The global north's expropriation of wealth and resources in the service of an ecocidal mode of production and consumption. This for him was the root of the problem. the ecological problem, not overpopulation as such. And as I say, techno-cornucopians today reduce Malthusianism to a primitivism, despite the fact that this model of biopolitical management is explicitly linked to specifically capitalist models of growth and work discipline. And that is an image of Larry Summers. I mean, much later on, is famously talked about how, countries in Africa aren't polluted enough. So, one of the things the book is trying to make a case for is sort of this continuity between the sort of technocratic segment of the global ruling class. That I think the figure of the Eternals in the vortex presciently captures. I mean, Boorman in this film really saw what was going to happen. And I think that's why I'm making a case for it as an interesting document. I mean, just to sort of slip this in, and I'm going to sort of move into the Utopia, close with my bit on Utopia. I mean, it's interesting to think about the casting in this case. I mean, people laughed that Connery went from being suave Bond in the tux to this very hairy, I don't know, barbarian man in this weird red leather diaper thing. But in some ways, it's the same figure. I think, and Boorman has actually confirmed this to me. I sort of spoke to him, right? He's sort of defamiliarizing the Bond type. I mean, if you think about Bond as a figure for Western espionage and counterinsurgency in the developing world. I mean, here you have an exterminator who's working on the behest of this immortal elite, right? And he discovers that he's been used, and he turns on the immortal elite. So I think that's an interesting aspect of the film, the casting. At the same time, I mean, I'll just sort of speak to this. I think it's more efficient way of sort of conveying this. I mean, it's not as if, I think that the film is critical of this Malthusian discourse because Boorman, and as I argue in the book, a lot of other thinkers saw this as a sort of an artificial, a sort of a false form of scarcity. I mean, they understood that it was sort of process. It was actually production and consumption in the West, primarily in the capitalist West, that was the root of the problem. At the same time, as you can see in the film, there is an embrace of limits, right? I mean, biophysical limits, and qualitative limits. I mean, what we learn about the Eternals and the vortex is they're absolutely miserable. And we learned actually that Zed was engineered by a group of dissident Eternals, specifically to bring the tabernacle down and to bring the gift of death to those who want the gift of death. So, I mean, there's this other sort of discourse of limits as actually essential to freedom and flourishing, a qualitative discourse of limits alongside this critique of Malthusianism. And I think that one of the things that Boorman is trying to do is to think utopia. Again, it might seem like this is a utopian film, right? But I think that The Vortex is a false utopia. And this idea of limits together. Yeah, so considering the dark tenor of the film as I've described it thus far, it might appear counterintuitive to link this work to utopia or utopian thinking. If anything, Boorman's film seems anti-utopian in its depiction of the vortex, an ideal state whose godlike immortal inhabitants want nothing so much as death to relieve the alienation and ennui that accompany their seemingly perfect lives. And Boorman drew on the utopian tradition in envisioning the look of the vortex and the dress of the Eternals. I mean, you can see here they're in this kind of like hippie medieval garb. And I mean, he's very much, I think, referencing William Morris's News from Nowhere, right? That late sort of pastoral utopian romance from the end of the 19th century. Of course, unlike Morris's Utopia, the vortex, as we have seen, vampirically runs on the immiseration, exploitation, and death of the brutal majority outside its walls, while the eternal 70s-era psych folk peasant routine is all play acting, like a cottagecore Instagram account avant la lettre. We might say that Boorman is exposing a false utopia here, and in a way that overlaps with Ursula Le Guin's contemporaneous short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Boorman is nonetheless very much against that dominant model of utopia as a geometric state of perfection, as it resembles nothing so much as a secular version of religious transcendence. It is this model of the geometric or programmatic utopia that makes so many utopian schemes and narratives boring, nightmarish, or both, shading off into dystopia. But rather than expressing a conservative anti-utopian vision based in some negative assessment of a fixed human nature, and therefore skeptical of every effort at radical social change, Boorman, like Le Guin and others, seeks to disentangle the utopian impulse from religious fantasies of perfection or godhood by way of science, technology, or rational planning. And that doesn't mean we have to reject all planning as such. Think the imperfect utopia, the utopia within limits, and biospheric limits in particular, all stemming from a materialist recognition that human freedom and flourishing are tied to a realm of necessity, to the fact that we are all rational, dependent animals who are born, who get ill, and who most importantly die. Keeping this vision in mind, Zardoz's articulation of utopia is a negative one, to be found neither in the false techno-utopia of the Vortex, nor the violent primitivism of Zed and the Exterminators, although the film deliberately invites such a misreading. There is one positive vision of the utopian impulse at work, which is more evident in Boorman's and Stair's novelization than in the film itself. May and a group of Eternals, women all, rather than begging for death at the hands of the exterminators who have breached the vortex after Zed destroys the tabernacle, announce their intention to settle among the brutals and selectively use their knowledge to start a new society. A few of them are pregnant by Zed, even as Zed is excluded from this new society, which is a break with their status quo, since reproduction was in vitro and automated in the vortex, a break like their new mortality. The only critic who really wrestled with Zardoz in terms of utopia and anti-utopianism is Jameson, in an essay called History and the Death Wish, Zardoz's Open Form, published in 1974. And he talks about how the film combined what he thought of as reactionary and progressive elements. This is a much more dogmatically Marxist Jameson, one of the first things that he writes. Jameson doesn't like the film's ideological ambiguity. He begins his analysis of the film reading through its initial depiction of the giant stone head as a re-dramatization of the idea of religion essentially developed by Enlightenment thinkers, priestcraft. And it's, of course, Zed's suspicion regarding his idol's falsity that motivates his sneaking himself into the head. But Zed's skepticism towards Zardoz inaugurates our exterminator's disillusionment as he uncovers the manipulative priestcraft of the Eternals behind both his false god and the reconstituted Bronze Age world of the Outlands, in line with Jameson's invocation of the anti-clerical Enlightenment. But to focus on Boorman's critique of religion in Jameson's Enlightenment terms too narrowly abstracts one very partial point from a more complicated story that includes the Eternals' own secular modernist faith in technological salvation and biopolitical population management. This was another religious idol in need of debunking for Boorman. And Boorman has said as much in interviews then and now. And like I said, we can really observe an admixture for me of insight and myopia in Jameson's dueling accounts of the vortex. And a whole chapter on this. On the one hand, he does see that it is an anti-colonial parable. The vortex as a representation of, say, the United States and its predatory, extractive relationship with the then Third World. But Jameson still can't rid himself of his suspicions regarding the allegedly anti-utopian intentions that drive Boorman to judge his utopia from the start, the vortex, which Jameson, I think, in sort of characteristic and too easy fashion, equates with sort of anti-totalitarian, anti-socialism. The young Jameson, in line with the traditions of Western Marxism, can only equate the vortex with utopia or an emancipated social order because he identifies emancipation with the fundamentally religious goal of human transcendence, albeit in a secular post-Enlightenment guise of perfection. This perfection primarily entails the conquest of our finite and fragile condition, often under the auspices of a perfected rationality, cleansed of affect and imagination, through which human beings can sever any trace of animality and ascend to godhood. I mean, in this way, there is continuity. I mean, even in people like Adorno, if you think about Adorno's debate with Bloch, between the perfectibilists of the radical Enlightenment, like Condorcet or Godwin, and these Western Marxists who seem to think, with the elimination of class society, death will go away, embodiment will go away. I mean, there's a strange overlap between this way of thinking and what's being spouted by people like Elon Musk or people like Ray Kurzweil. Boorman is pushing against this. The critical Aquarian thinkers are pushing against this. They want to distinguish the utopian impulse from these Promethean fantasies of perfection and Zardoz. The film poses these questions, which are even more salient now in our era of catabolic capitalist ecological collapse. How can we think within limits? How can we think utopia within limits? And how to distinguish the surplus limits imposed by an artificial and exploitative social arrangement from those necessary biophysical limits attendant upon our creaturely condition, right? Boorman's fable doesn't dispense with utopia so much as it insists that our only feasible and substantive version of a liberated social order can only come by way of the natality, finitude, and embodiment we share, while our common creaturely condition offers a foundation for a more radical egalitarianism. The labor, life, and time we might win back from the impersonal imperatives of the market under another dispensation require the finitude that marks the condition we share with non-human creatures in their life world. This is an example of utopia limited, in the words of literary critic Anahid Nosessian. My last passage. The primary question that united these thinkers, from Brown to Illich to Mies to Le Guin to this young Boorman, was how to exit the dead end of industrial modernism and its legitimating fictions, utilitarianism, Prometheanism, productivism, and its ecocidal dreams of endless growth for its own sake, or secular immortality, in the face of interrelated material, ecological, and spiritual crises, but without sliding into the reactionary anti-modernism that led, certain intellectuals, Foucault briefly, to embrace the Iranian Revolution at the end of the 70s. I mean, these are a series of important questions. The urgency of these crises has increased 100-fold since the 70s, but the questions remain unanswered.
Thanks, Anthony. You touch on so many crucial topics, I think. I do have a first question for you about your coinage of critical Aquarianism. My question is, if you could explain what does Aquarian mean, and what is critical about it? Could you explain more?
Well, I mean, Aquarian, of course, is a kind of, the age of Aquarius. I mean, it's a term that's sort of, used, oftentimes now in a slightly mocking or even disparaging way to, I guess, refer to like the kind of semi-mystical or woo-woo tendencies of the counterculture. I would say, to put a more positive spin on that and some of the more positive elements of the counterculture. I know, Mark Fisher actually was working on this toward the end of his life, this idea of acid communism. I mean, I think, I think that there were actually these there was a positive move, a positive need for enchantment against the constant drive toward disenchantment, right? So I'm trying to at least recover, some positive sense of certain elements of the counterculture, but I'm marrying it to critical because I don't think that, I don't think that an embrace of that kind of enchantment, and I talked about, some of these thinkers' investment in folk traditions, for instance, or their interest in spirituality, that should not preclude rationality and the spirit of critique in the more sort of, narrow philosophical fashion, going back to Kant and extending through Western Marxists like Adorno. So, this attempt to think, if you want to, I've put it this way, this attempt to think both, an urge to enchantment and a certain, urge or imperative for demystification, necessary demystification, ideological demystification together. Right? So to not fall into the trap of kind of solipsistic obscurantism, irrationalism on the one hand, or this kind of like cold stream, demystificatory project, which, I mean, despite oftentimes the specifically Marxist language, I mean, ends up overlapping with utilitarianism at its worst, or the more reductive forms of rationalism. And I think the Romantics did. I don't think the first generation Romantics were irrationalists. I don't think they rejected the. I mean, this is an easy way of depicting them, right? I mean, people like Frederick Beiser pushed against this. I think a lot of these critical Aquarians were doing the same thing. I mean, think about Ursula Le Guin. I mean, she was a kind of anarcho-communist, in some ways a rigorous, radical thinker, but someone who embraced Taoism, right? And someone who embraced limits. I mean, there's a reason why she describes Inaris in the novel The Dispossessed in the way that she does. It's a resource deficient moon. So that's what I would say of that.
Thank you, Anthony, for sharing your time and thoughts and provocations as well with us. I invite you to pick up a copy of Anthony's book Against the Vortex, which is out now with Zer0 Books. Thank you for coming, and see you next time.